All right. Thank you, Leslie. All right, so yes, PancakesCon, this will be my talk. So my name's Neill Perry. I'm a professional cookie maker. I'm an amateur cookie baker and a lifetime cookie eater. Before we begin, a very important question, and that is, how do witches bake cookies in a coven? So I'm just going to warn you now, there will be cookie jokes throughout this presentation. So as Leslie alluded to, this presentation deals with two types of cookies. So we have digital cookies and we have real life cookies. So let's start. The first half, we'll talk about the digital cookies. So what are digital cookies? Well, they're just text values that are stored in your browser. And your browser will send these cookies with every HTTP request. Typically, the browser will send it in an HTTP header, and it will send the cookies based on their cookie scope. And I'll talk more about what that is. But just bottom line, cookies are basically text values. So going back to, real life, there are different types of cookies. Some are better than others. And similarly, there are different types of digital cookies. And so they have kind of different uses. So let's talk about, first use of a cookie might be personalization. So for example, let's say you go to a web browser and you want to see this browser in dark mode. So the web server might make a record of that and set a cookie that says dark mode. So it knows that every time you visit that website, it will show you the dark mode. And that's an example of personalization. Another type of cookie would be one used for tracking. So basically, this cookie is just going to track what you do on the website, maybe track what you do more broadly. And that could be used for, improved user experience. It might be used to give you tailored ads. So that's an example of a tracking cookie. And finally, there are session cookies. So session cookies are cookies that they have your session state. They indicate to the server that this person, who you are, and that you are an authenticated user. I'll explain why we need session cookies later, but I want to transition from session cookies and really kind of start off with, why is this topic important? So why should we understand cookies? Why should we understand their vulnerabilities? And that is, so cookies, they store credentials for a user's web session. And if a malicious actor can get your session credentials, they are essentially you. They can do whatever you can do. They can access all your email, they can access your bank accounts. And so these particular types of cookies, these session cookies, are very powerful. And these are the cookies that hackers or attackers are going to go after. They don't care about your dark mode cookies. They don't care about your advertising cookies. They're really going to want these session cookies. And so let me give you some examples. In 2021, 2 years ago, some hackers, they hacked into the game company Electronic Arts, and they stole the user code and they dumped it, and they tried to extort some money. The hackers claimed that they were able to get initial access into the game company by buying a session cookie. They bought some engineer's session cookie off the dark web, and that's kind of how they got penetrated into the network. That's what they claim, unverified, but it's a plausible attack vector. More recently, last year, Microsoft Threat Intel Center, they released a report in which they uncovered a phishing campaign. And in this phishing campaign, the attackers, they tricked users into clicking on a spoofed website. And they used the spoofed website to steal the user's session cookies. Because again, session cookies are very powerful. And once you have these session cookies, you can do lots of things with them. So session cookies, we talk a lot about, in cybersecurity, you have strong passwords and use multi-factor authentication, but session cookies can bypass that. They can bypass multi-authentication because a session cookie essentially tells the web server, I'm already authenticated. I am this person. So this is why this topic is important. Okay, now let's talk about, why does a browser use cookies? And that goes to the nature of the internet. The protocol that undermines much of the websites is the HTTP protocol. And this is a communication protocol, and it is a stateless protocol. So stateless meaning no state. And so what is a stateless protocol? A stateless protocol is one in which the receiver, in this case their server, it doesn't retain any kind of memory of who the communicator is. So each request is kind of handled in isolation. Each request is processed independently of all the others. So it constantly has no idea who you are. And stateless protocol has many benefits, but there is that problem of kind of remembering who you are. And to kind of remediate that problem, way back a long time ago, we created cookies. And so cookies can store, kind of retain state information from request to request. And so when you, the client, your browser sends requests, you send some cookies and it says, oh, I know who you are. You like dark mode, or you like these type of ads, or you've already logged in. I can see your session cookie. And so cookies are a response to the HTTP stateless protocol. An example that I like to use, one of my favorite movies, it's called Finding Nemo. And this is a Pixar movie. One of the main characters is Dory. And so Dory suffers from short-term memory loss. And as someone who suffers short-term memory loss, she has to constantly, people around her have to constantly reintroduce themselves to her. And so that would be an example of kind of a stateless protocol. When your browser communicates to a web server, it has to say, hey, this is me, Marlin the Clownfish. Yep, it's still me, Marlin the Clownfish. And so that's kind of what the roles that cookies serve. Okay, so we talked about introduction, why we need cookies. Just let's dig into ingredients. Cookies have ingredients. The proper term, I believe, is attributes. So for any website you go to, you can examine the cookies that your browser is sending for that particular domain. Usually a simple left click in Google Chrome or Firefox, you can see the cookies. And here, just a screenshot of cookies I use for bbc.com. So every cookie has, a name, key value pairs. So key is going to be a name, the value is there, that's the text. I don't know anything about the BBC website, but looking at the cookie names, you can kind of get a sense for the purpose of the cookies. You can see a cookie called session. We see a cookie called tracking. We kind of know what that does. There in the middle columns, we're going to see domain and path. And domain and path, that's going to be the scope of the cookie. And that's going to tell the browser when to send that cookie. Because the browser is not going to send all the cookies to all the websites. Only the ones scoped to that particular domain. Next, we see the expiration date on cookies. And one of them expires 1,000 years from now. And the last three columns are special attributes. They're also called flags. So it's going to be HTTP only, secure, and same site. And just remember those. I will talk about those at the end when I talk about countermeasures. But these are kind of the basic attributes to a cookie. All right. So we've talked about why this presentation is important. We kind of got a good introduction to digital cookies. Let's get to the fun stuff. That's cookie attacks. So this topic, the title of this topic is cookie poisoning, hijacking, bypassing, and baking. So let's start with cookie poisoning. Something kind of confusing if you research this topic is that the term cookie poisoning is broadly defined and it's used very different ways depending on whoever's speaking. So you may not always get a same definition if you research this, just a warning. Maybe that happens frequently in cybersecurity, I don't know. But so I'm going to start with a very narrow definition of cookie poisoning. And the narrow definition of cookie poisoning is that you're modifying the cookie to your benefit. So let's say you go to a website, example.com website, and you see the cookie sets username, and you modify your cookie, says instead of username Bob, I'm going to say username admin. And maybe that works. Maybe modifying your cookie gives you admin privileges. You're able to escalate your privileges beyond what was originally intended. That's pretty rare attack. This version of cookie poisoning, it's pretty rare. Most websites are not that poorly configured, but that's the narrow definition of cookie. The next slide, we're going to talk about the broader family of cookie attacks and the definitions that go in against. So, different cookie attacks. And so to introduce this slide, I have a stock photo of a hacker, because that's how they operate. And so we have different types of cookie attacks: cookie hijacking, session hijacking, session fixation, session forgery, and cookie jar overflow. Like I said, some of these terms overlap, and some of the attack patterns are very similar. So I'm just going to focus on the basics as opposed to like semantic distinctions among them. So we'll start with kind of cookie session hijacking. So before we talked at the beginning about session cookies, and that these session cookies store information about your session. Typically, it might be that you've logged in, that you're an authenticated user, and this cookie is going to say, hey, here's my session ID. In this slide, you can see, hey, the session ID is 12345. That is a terrible session ID. It is not random. It's easily guessed, and it would be bad. But you get the general idea. The session ID is going to be some alphanumeric string. Hopefully it's longer. Hopefully it's random. And so cookie hijacking and session hijacking are basically the same in that they're trying to get that session ID. Because once they get that session ID, the attacker can then impersonate you to the web server and start doing bad things. So here is an example from our friends at OWASP. So an attacker, eavesdrops on communications, and they're able to intercept a session ID. Maybe it's sent in plain text. Maybe they're able to guess it. And once they get that session ID, they're then able to communicate to the web server as if they were you. I do want to point out one, this is kind of non sequitur. So reading up last night on Google documentation, they talked about some of their cookies that they use in Google services. And they talk, and the links they go to protect their cookies kind of speak to the power of session cookies. And so, Google services, they actually use a broad array of cookies. And one of the cookies has your Google ID and your Google ID history. And so what Google does to secure this cookie is they will digitally sign it, and then they encrypt it. And so what they're doing is they're trying to protect their users. All right, so session hijacking, cookie hijacking, essentially it's the same kind of vector there. They're stealing that information. Man-in-the-middle attack. So this kind of goes along with the slide before about how are they able to get these session cookies, these cookies. And this goes back, so from last year, the phishing campaign that Microsoft identified, the attacker sent phishing emails. These phishing emails, they contain a link. It looks like it's a legitimate link, but it's very long and no one really reads their URLs when they click on them. And so it secretly redirects the users to a malicious website. It looks legitimate, but it's actually just a spoof. And so people see this malicious website, they don't read the URL, and they input their credentials. And these phishing campaigners, they're able to get this session cookies and then get access to the email. And that's what they were doing. They were getting access to business emails, and they're using that to spread more malware and more confusion. So the man-in-the-middle attack, that's one way to hijack cookies. Another way is our old friend Crosssite scripting. You've never heard of Crosssite scripting. It's a whole other world. I won't go into depth, but it's a very well-known, very powerful web vulnerability that you find in websites. This is one way of taking a user's cookies. So it's beyond the scope of this talk, but essentially an attacker injects malicious code into a website, and a user, executes it unknowingly, and the attacker is then able to get access to their cookie. And kind of the vulnerability arises because web servers trust their clients. Why would a client execute malicious code on themselves, not realizing that it can be introduced or injected without their knowledge? So that's cross-site scripting. It's like man-in-the-middle. It's another way of hijacking and stealing someone's cookies. All right, what's next? Malware. Okay, so malware, again, kind of beyond the scope of this talk, but malware is another vector for stealing someone's cookies. And this is kind of interesting. I learned this from Sophos. And what they saw, I think it was last year, they saw a malware campaign in which the threats, the attackers were stealing cookies as a way of expanding their access or moving laterally. So they were already on the network. And what they were doing, they're executing Perl scripts and trying to steal cookies from people's browsers. And those cookies, they could then use to get even more access to more accounts. And I was really impressed. So at the beginning of the talk, I talked about using cookies to get initial access. But here's an example where they're using cookies to expand their access. This is so interesting to me. Anyway, okay. So we talked about cookies, hijacking, session hijacking. Session forgery is essentially where an attacker tries to guess the session ID, or they try to predict the session ID. Cookie jar overflow. So I don't talk about cookie jar overflow or fixation, but cookie jar overflow is where they try to force the browser to delete valid cookies and they inject malicious cookies. Okay, so you can practice stealing cookies legally through Portswiger's Web Security Academy. I love this academy. I started it earlier this year. So Portswiger, they're a software company. They produce the Burp Suite software that's used for penetration testing. It's used for AppSec testing, very powerful. And they have a variety of labs where you can actually test different type of attack vectors on a website. And they actually have two that relate to stealing and hijacking cookies. So one of them, you can steal cookies via Crosssite scripting, and you can also manipulate a cookie through manipulating the DOM. So they have labs, but they also have content that kind of explain the labs, explain what's happening. Don't worry if you get stuck; they have answers. So and it's free. Oh no, this is not a paid endorsement. This is just I just like free training. So free training is always good. Okay, so we talked about stealing cookies. Stealing cookies is bad. Obviously, it's bad. It's dangerous. It's a serious vulnerability. You could lose a lot. Powerful impact to your company, you personally. So how can the good guys protect their cookies? Well, first off, they can restrict access to the cookies. I don't know if you remember at the beginning of this talk, I talked about the flags. Some of the attributes of cookies are secure, HTTP only, and same site. So when the secure flag is checked on a cookie, that means the browser will only transmit the cookie over HTTPS, not over HTTP OS. So that kind of protects the confidentiality of the cookie. There's also a flag called HTTP only. And what that means, it makes this cookie inaccessible to the JavaScript that might be on the website. And so what HTTP only does, it mitigates some of that risk from cross-site scripting vectors. And then finally, we have the same site flag. And so what this does, it controls which websites are able to send these cookies. And so taken together, these can all help protect their cookies and make for a more secure web experience. Some other countermeasures, websites can use short-term credentials. Going back to the Google documents, the Google cookies, they have cookies that expire after 30 minutes. So that's a very short-term cookie. When you have cookies that never expire, that can be risky. Another countermeasure is enforce HSTS. That means HTTPS only from the browser to the server. Also, for your web applications, you want to use long random session IDs, never recycle session IDs. Basically, from a developer's perspective, don't do this on your own. Don't roll your own crypto, don't make your own session IDs. Whatever framework you're using probably has a way to do that for you. All right. Okay, that concludes the technical portion of digital cookies. Digital cookies. Now we're going to move on to real cookies. And another question: why did the cookie go to the doctor? Because it was feeling crummy. You may not laugh, but I don't know. I think these jokes are funny. So cookies, the word cookie is from North American English. It refers to something, a baked good that is small, flat, and sweet, usually sugar, butter, flour. Real cookies are not free. So the cookies you get on browsers are free. Real cookies, you have to buy them yourselves or make them. I'm going to teach you how to make them. We're just going to do a simple chocolate chip cookie recipe that I got. So I'll post the recipe in the slides, and yeah, we'll try to cook along. That's the next slide. Okay, so let's talk about why you should bake cookies. Well, first off, they taste good. They'll make you feel better. They will make you punctual. They'll give you photographic memory. So eat lots of cookies. Okay. So step one, the cookies, we're going to preheat the oven to 375. And next, baking. Yes. Okay. So we're going to talk about some principles of baking. And so these principles can be applied to no matter whatever type of cookie you want to bake or whatever type of bread you want to bake. And so these are just general principles. First one, precision. Baking is kind of the chemistry of cooking, and you want to have precise ingredients. Excuse me, precise measurements. So typically, when you cook, you use like you measure by volume, but a more accurate way, measure by weight. So I encourage you, by a smaller scale. That's going to make for a better baking experience. The next principle is ingredients. You want to use high quality ingredients. There's a saying, there's an American pizza company that says better ingredients, better pizza. The same thing is true for baking. If you use high quality ingredients, you're going to get better product. And finally, technique. So baking involves a variety of techniques, and as far as mixing ingredients or preparing them. And so you want to master that technique to get the right outcome. And the last principle is practice. And this is kind of bleeds over to cybersecurity. If you're new to cybersecurity or new to whatever, practice makes perfect. Maybe you burn your cookies the first time. That's okay. Just keep practicing. You'll get better. Okay, let's dive into the cookies. We're going to make chocolate chip cookies. My personal favorite. I was born and raised on these. They were made with love. Here's the recipe. Again, I'll post the link. This recipe is from America's Test Kitchen, also known as Cooks Illustrated. They put out like a monthly magazine. You will also see this recipe plagiarized by food bloggers who can't come up with their own recipes. But no reason to linger here. And really the heart of this recipe is browning the butter. So we are going to brown the butter. And so what you do is you place like 10 tablespoons, like 2/3 of the butter, you're going to place it in a saucepan over the stove, and you're going to heat it. And you're not just going to melt the butter, you're going to cook it until it turns brown, as you can see in this GIF. And so what's going on is a chemical reaction. It's called the Mayar reaction. And it's similar to what happens when you toast bread. And what you're really doing, you're kind of toasting the butter to bring out some more flavor. So when you brown the butter, what happens is first, water evaporates. Second, the milk solids and the fat, they'll separate, and the milk solids will turn brown. And when those milk solids turn brown, that's going to make for a nuttier flavor, hints of toffee, hints of butterscotch, deeper, better tasting cookie. So we're going to brown the butter. I already did this. I don't know if you will see this at all. Okay, I'll hold this up. So, wow, that looks black. It's not. It's just really brown. It's not even burnt. You will think you're burning the butter. You are not. And when you hold this up, it's not burnt. It's just brown. So what you're going to do is you're going to mix your brown butter with. You're not going to brown all the butter. So you're going to leave some and set aside. Your brown butter is going to be very warm because it's been on the stove for a while. Make sure you get all those brown milk solid particles at the bottom of the pans. We want that flavor. Okay. Let's mix. So brown the butter. That's really the kind of the heart of this recipe. Next part. Okay. I want to talk about, we're going to mix in the sugar and the eggs. And there's a principle in baking that So in baking, you have wet ingredients and you have dry ingredients. And the best practice is you mix all your wet ingredients together on one side, and you mix all your dry ingredients on the other side. And then once you've mixed those two together, then you combine wet and dry. And so right now we're mixing all the wet and dry. Excuse me, right now we're mixing all the wet. So the wet is the brown butter. I have my eggs. I have 1 egg and 1 egg yolk. I'm gonna mix that in. I'm now going to mix in the sugar. So you can see, I don't know if you can see this, but you can see that there's a lot of brown sugar in this recipe. Brown sugar, so it has more brown sugar than you might typically find in a chocolate chip recipe, but it's gonna make for a chewier cookie. And chewy cookies are good. You want chewy cookies. Hard cookies are not good. Got some vanilla extract from McCormick. Again, high quality ingredients. I recommend, King Arthur flour, Ghirardelli chocolate, dark chocolate, and yeah, McCormick pure vanilla extract. Okay, so what we got going, I'm mixing all the wet ingredients. Let's see if I can, here, I'll mix these up and I'll show it. It's proof I'm actually doing this. So what's happening? So remember we browned the butter. The brown butter just came from the stove top. It's pretty hot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix this together, but then I'm going to let it sit and rest. So if you want to give that hot butter time to dissolve the sugar. Dissolve the sugar. Want it well. Let the hot fat work its magic. Okay. So we mix in the egg yolk, stir, and okay. I'm gonna be honest with you. My butter's not quite that hot because I browned it this morning. I just had it lukewarm right before this talk, but it's mostly melted everything, dissolved everything. It's cookie batter. You take my word for it. I will say when you cook things with brown butter, it's going to make things look darker than normal because again, you've literally toasted the butter. So your cookies will look darker. If you make cakes or bread with brown butter, it's just going to look darker. There's nothing wrong. That's the coloration. You just apply heat to butter to unlock the flavor crystals. There are no flavor crystals. I'm just saying things. Okay, so we mixed in all the wet ingredients. Okay, now we have our dry ingredients. Okay, hold on. Let me mix it one more time. Okay. So remember, I said you mix all wet together and mix all dry together. And so here are my dry ingredients. Oh yeah, I don't know if you can see that. So what we got here, I mixed the flour and the baking soda. It's now ready to mix into that. All right. Okay. So I'm gonna mix in this flour. Rookie mistake that I've made before is you don't want to dump all the flour in at once. You just want to do it like by thirds, because if you dump all that flour at once, it's gonna be hard to mix it. And so again, that's kind of another principle of baking. The technique. You want it well mixed. You don't want like parts. You don't want like fruitcake or like clumps of butter or clumps of flour because that's not good. I'll bite that. What's going on? Okay, so put a third of flour, another third of flour. Oh, I'm going in it focus. Yeah, I think my camera's trying to autofocus in flour. Anyway, I'm still mixing the flour. Oh yeah. Wow, I'm just looking at the chat. Thank you, Alan Miller. Yeah, so I actually so one thing about cooking, baking it is a science. But one thing I like about Cooks Illustrated, and there's actually some other blogs, and I see there's a book recommendation, is that if you really understand like what's going on, why you do things, then that will make you a better baker. You'll kind of give you the freedom to like ad lib because you'll know why do we toast the butter, or why do you toast nuts, or why do you mix wet and dry. So I don't know. I'm always kind of interested in why do we do this? And once you understand, go on and invent your own recipes. Okay, here just mixing the last of dry ingredients, taking a long time. Don't eat cookie dough. I'm supposed to say that legally, but to be honest, I've eaten a lot of cookie dough in my life. So I don't know, maybe it's helped me, maybe it's held me back. Okay, so we're talking about we're getting ready to cook. We preheat the oven to 375. We're going to pull out a cookie baking sheet. Recommend, for your baking sheet, recommend lining it with either parchment or aluminum foil. You don't want to do PAM or nonstick spray because that nonstick spray might interfere with the baking process. It might make the cookie runny, or you don't want to mess with that. Yeah, that's a nice. Oh, last part, the chocolate chips. Pasteurize the eggs. Thank you. Okay, I got the chips. I strongly recommend dark chocolate, 60%. I grew up eating semi-sweet chocolate chip cookies, and listen, semi-sweet chocolate tastes like wax to me now. It's just gross. No offense if you like semi-sweet chocolate. It's weird, I guess. I don't know. But again, highly recommend dark chocolate. You can actually taste what you're eating. Okay, I got the cookie dough. Bam. Ta-da. That's cookie dough. That actually worked. Okay, next. What's our next slide? Okay, so now we're gonna bake this. Again, we want cookies that, the purpose of this recipe, you want cookies that are both chewy and crispy. So we're gonna bake them until the edges are light brown. And so the edge is gonna give us the crisp, and the middle will give us that chewy factor. And we're gonna parcel off the cookie dough, and pretty large balls is what they recommend, 3 tablespoons. That's gonna make for some pretty big cookies. But again, it's gonna give you that nice blend, chewy with crunch. Bake 10 to 14 minutes at 375. I will say this, based on personal experience, some ovens run hot and some ovens run cold. And what that means is just understand where your oven is and adjust your bake time accordingly. Watch, check in on the cookies about 10 minutes to see where you are. I personally, I don't know if this is a good idea, rotate the cookies halfway because the back of my oven's hotter than the front of the oven. But yeah, bake until the edges are brown, but the center is still soft. Okay. All right. Next. Post-bake procedures. Okay, you finish your baking and the edges are brown, but the center will still be soft, and that's okay because the cookie's hot and the center is still like forming up. It's gonna finish the baking process kind of outside the oven. Again, I highly recommend. Oh no. Okay, highly recommend. Bam, a wire rack for cooling. What's that's gonna allow? It's gonna allow air to flow under the cookies. Kind of stop the baking process. You don't have a wire rack, you can always use like a cutting board or something. That'd be good too. Maybe not on the stove top because that might still be hot. Yeah. So if you don't want to bake all these cookies at once, if you want to store, you can freeze these cookies like all cookie dough. You can freeze it. I highly recommend storing it as little balls. That way, when you want to bake them, it's just easier to take frozen cookie balls as opposed to de-thawing the whole thing. That way you can, I just want to have one cookie today. And you take one frozen cookie ball, pop it in your oven, your toaster oven, bam, you're good to go. Okay, that's it. Oh, one more question. How do German cookies say hello? Gluten Tag. Anyway, that's yes. Thank you. I'm reading the comments now. Dark chocolate chips don't melt as easily. Yes. Go with dark chocolate chips. So I finished a little early, but if you have any questions, you can post your questions here. You can in the Track 1 Slack. I will bake these cookies and I'll post a photo later today. I'll post a link to the recipe so you can just jump straight to that and use that. But yeah, baking's fun. Encourage you to try it. Any questions?